Every single human being eventually confronts this really terrifying reality. We are finite beings.
Right.
We are going to die, and we are going to lose the people we love.
Yeah, it is the universal human condition.
And that profound awareness creates this fundamental, almost paralyzing anxiety that kind of shadows our entire lives. But according to the author we are discussing today, this existential fear is not just some psychological burden we carry around.
No, not at all. The book argues that it is actually the core driving force behind the entire history of Western philosophy.
Which is such an incredibly provocative premise.
It really is. The book is called A Brief History of Thought, A Philosophical Guide to Living. It was written by the French philosopher Luc Ferry, and we are looking at the English translation published in 2011.
You're experiencing a unique two-voice conversation presented by Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
And just to be clear, this is a summary review of A Brief History of Thought. We are going to walk through what the book covers, its structure, the key arguments, and the major examples so you can follow the full picture without getting lost in all the analysis.
Exactly. So Ferry attempts to define exactly what philosophy is, and he does this by contrasting it directly with religion.
Right, because both religion and philosophy, according to the author, are ultimately trying to save us from the terror of death.
But the crucial distinction Ferry makes right at the beginning is how these two disciplines actually achieve that salvation. Religion, it demands that we find comfort through faith in an external divine authority.
Whereas philosophy is much stricter. Philosophy demands that salvation has to come entirely through our own innate faculty of reason.
We basically have to think our way out of the darkness.
Exactly. And to map out how humanity has attempted this over thousands of years, the book uses a strict three-part structural framework. Ferry applies this exact same lens to every era of Western thought.
Which makes it really easy to follow.
Yeah, it does. The first dimension of this framework is theoria. That is the attempt to understand the fundamental nature of the world around us. Like, are we in a chaotic void, or are we in a structured universe?
Right, and then the second dimension is ethics. Because once you understand the nature of the world, you have to figure out how human beings should behave and how we should coexist within that world.
Precisely. And then the third dimension, which Ferry says is the most critical, is salvation or wisdom.
Which answers that ultimate question of how to live well and die well.
Right, but relying only on human understanding instead of supernatural promises.
So the rest of the book uses those three specific dimensions to map out the 5 great eras of Western thought. Ferry shows how each era attempts to answer the exact same fundamental human problem.
Because when you are lying awake at night, worrying about the end of your life, you need an answer.
You do. So how did the ancient thinkers find that answer using only reason?
Well, the book starts with the era Ferry calls the Greek miracle, and he focuses primarily on Stoicism. The author maps out the Stoic worldview, starting with their specific version of theoria.
And their theory is fascinating, because when the Stoics looked up at the night sky, they didn't just see a random scattering of stars.
No, they saw a perfectly ordered, highly rational, and completely divine whole. They believe the universe is governed by this underlying principle called logos.
Which translates to universal reason, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Everything in reality operates perfectly within this massive rational system.
Now, if you genuinely believe the universe is already a perfect rational machine, that obviously directly shapes your ethics.
Right, because you cannot improve upon perfection.
Yeah, exactly. Therefore, the book suggests the ethical imperative is simply to live in harmony with this universal order. You have to align your daily actions with the way the cosmos already functions.
And the book explains that the Stoics call this achieving appropriate action. It basically means finding your specific assigned place within the universal order and fulfilling that role without resistance.
Because if you fight against the cosmic order, you are only going to create suffering for yourself.
Which brings us to their version of salvation. The Stoic achieve salvation through a practice called apatheia.
And we should probably clarify that term because it sounds a lot like the modern English word apathy.
Yeah, it does. But Ferry is very clear that it is not about being lazy or indifferent.
Right. It is entirely different. Apatheia is a disciplined, rigorous detachment from the fleeting pleasures and pains of life.
Through this detachment, the individual realizes that death is not annihilation at all. Death is merely a transition.
Your physical substance and your breath are simply redistributed back into the eternal, perfect cosmic order.
Because you belong to the universe, and the universe is eternal.
You know, the analogy that came to my mind reading this section is a giant, perfectly functioning clockwork. Every human being is just a specific gear with an unchangeable place in that mechanism.
That is a great way to look at it.
And when a gear finally stops turning, the metal isn't destroyed. It is simply melted down and cast into a new part for the exact same clock.
Right?
But there's a terrifying flaw in that beautiful Stoic clockwork. If I am just a gear, what happens to my individual identity when my life ends?
That is the big question.
Yeah, doesn't this philosophy completely obliterate who I am as a person? And furthermore, doesn't this perfectly ordered system fundamentally justify severe social inequality?
Well, the book acknowledges those exact criticisms. Ferry points out that Stoic society accepted existing hierarchies,
Mm.
including slavery, as natural expressions of the cosmic order.
The gear just has to accept its place.
Right. But more importantly, that for the question of human mortality, the Stoic cosmos is entirely impersonal. It is beautiful, but it does not love you.
What?
When you die, your individual self is permanently erased. And according to the book, this loss of personal identity was a fatal flaw of Stoicism. It created this massive psychological vacuum that early Christianity would eventually step in to fill.
Which leads us directly into the second era the book explores, the Christian Revolution.
Right.
The text argues that Christianity triumphed across the Western world precisely because it offered a solution to the impersonal nature of the Greek cosmos.
The author details how Christianity completely revolutionized the concept of theoria. In the Greek era, the logos was this cold, abstract structure.
But Christianity takes that underlying principle of the universe and transforms it into a living, loving person in the figure of Jesus Christ.
Right. The rational blueprint of the cosmos is no longer a machine. It is a divine individual who actually cares about humanity.
And this shift in theoria fundamentally alters the ethical dimension as well, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The book outlines a massive departure from the rigid natural hierarchies of the Stoics. Christian ethics introduced the primacy of free choice, the supreme importance of the inner life, and this really radical concept of universal equality before God.
And Ferry makes a very specific historical claim here that I found super interesting. The book argues that the modern concept of human rights is entirely inconceivable without this Christian foundational belief that all humans possess equal dignity.
Yeah, the ethical shift is profound. But the true power of the Christian Revolution, according to the author, lies in its doctrine of salvation.
Because salvation is no longer an impersonal melting back into the cosmic clockwork.
Exactly. It becomes the promise of personal immortality. It is the absolute guarantee that your individual identity will be preserved after death.
And that you will experience a physical reunion with your loved ones in eternity.
The text is really fascinating in this section because the author explicitly highlights his own perspective. As a committed secular humanist, Ferry openly concedes that Christian salvation is the most personally effective answer ever offered to the problem of death.
Yeah, he says it completely neutralizes the terror of mortality. So why does the author ultimately reject it?
Well, the answer traces directly back to the core premise established in the introduction of the book.
Right, he rejects it because Christianity requires faith in divine revelation.
Exactly. The book maintains that philosophy demands we solve the problem of mortality using only our own reason. Because Christian salvation relies on faith in an external God rather than self-generated rational thought, the author argues it is disqualified as a purely philosophical solution.
So the Christian promise held Western society together for centuries. What finally broke it?
The book explains that the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries completely shattered those ancient worldviews. Scientists like Galileo and Newton proved that the universe was not a small, Earth-centric Christian creation.
Nor was it a perfectly ordered Stoic cosmos.
Right. Science revealed an infinite, cold, mathematically governed void.
And humans suddenly found themselves entirely alone in an indifferent universe.
It is a terrifying shift. The book walks us through the humanist response to this void, starting with René Descartes.
Descartes introduces methodological doubt, right?
Yes. He argued that we must doubt everything we have ever been taught by tradition or religion. He establishes a new critical spirit where knowledge must be entirely self-generated by the human mind.
And after Descartes clears the foundation, the book introduces Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau makes what Ferry calls the defining move of modern humanism.
He places the human being firmly at the center of this newly empty universe.
Exactly. And he defines humanity by a specific concept called perfectibility.
Perfectibility is crucial here. Unlike animals, who are strictly guided by biological instincts, humans possess the freedom to transcend nature.
We are not programmed.
Right. We can choose, we can change, and we can perfect ourselves over time.
To use an analogy for Rousseau's concept of perfectibility, it's like humans are no longer actors following a script written by nature or by God. We are standing on an empty stage, and we are forced to improvise our own play.
That is exactly it. But improvising an ethical system from scratch is incredibly difficult.
It is.
So building on Rousseau, Immanuel Kant constructs the ethical superstructure of this new humanism. The book details Kant's categorical imperative.
And Kant argues that to be truly ethical, human actions must be completely disinterested, right? You cannot act out of self-interest, fear of punishment, or tribal loyalty.
Exactly. Furthermore, your actions must be universally applicable. You must act only according to rules that you would logically wish all of humanity to follow simultaneously.
The ethical framework is incredibly robust, but the book notes that humanism struggles deeply with the dimension of salvation.
Because without God or a perfect cosmos to save us, humanity attempts to save itself.
Humanism attempts to create what Ferry calls religions of earthly salvation. These include vast ideologies like nationalism, scientism, and communism.
Right. The Humanist Project attempts to replace divine salvation in the afterlife with historical progress in the present world.
The tragedy, as the book points out, is that these earthly religions historically resulted in catastrophic violence.
They demanded that millions of individuals sacrifice their actual, present lives for abstract future utopias.
This is Mindful Moments, where we turn powerful books into clear, rational conversations for readers, students, and educators. So, if humanity improvising its own script led to the trenches of the First World War and the gulags, where does philosophy go next?
The massive failure of those earthly religions leads directly to the fourth era detailed in the book, postmodernity. And Ferry focuses entirely on the case of Friedrich Nietzsche.
The book argues that Nietzsche's primary project was to dismantle the entire history of Western philosophy.
Yes, he viewed the failures of both Christianity and modern humanism as symptoms of a much deeper disease.
The book summarizes Nietzsche's theoria as a diagnosis of nihilism.
But crucially, Nietzsche defines nihilism very differently than we normally use the word today.
Right, he defines it not as believing in nothing, but as denying the actual physical world in favor of a fake, perfect world elsewhere.
According to the book, Nietzsche believed that waiting around for a Christian heaven or sacrificing yourself for a communist utopia are both acts of nihilism.
Because you are devaluing the messy, painful, real life you currently possess for an illusion?
Exactly. Which leads to Nietzsche's ethics. The book describes this as the division of the world into active and reactive forces.
The text explains that reactive forces are driven by resentment, guilt, and the need to oppose others.
And Nietzsche argues that traditional morality is entirely reactive. It was basically built by the weak to restrain the strong.
Active forces, conversely, are creative and spontaneously affirming. They find pure joy in existence without needing an enemy to define themselves against.
Right, so Nietzsche's ethical ideal is the will to power. This means harmonizing your internal forces to achieve what he calls the grand style of living.
Which brings us to the postmodern version of salvation. The book explains that Nietzsche finds salvation in the concept of amor fati.
Which translates to the absolute love of your fate.
It requires living entirely and fiercely in the present moment. You must accept everything exactly as it is without hoping for a better future or regretting the past.
Right.
But this raises a clarifying question regarding the text. How does Nietzsche's love of fate differ from the ancient Stoic acceptance of fate we discussed earlier? Because they sound nearly identical on the surface.
The book clarifies that distinction very carefully. Stoic acceptance is rooted in rational submission. You accept your fate calmly because you recognize it is part of a perfect, divine cosmic machine.
But Nietzsche's amor fati is rooted entirely in individual creative power.
Exactly. The universe is not perfect, it is not rational, it is chaotic and often brutal. You must love your fate anyway as a defiant assertion of your own supreme, joyful vitality.
But while Ferry clearly respects Nietzsche's diagnosis of nihilism, he raises a pretty severe critique of this postmodern salvation.
He does. The book argues that postmodernism ultimately becomes far too destructive.
Ferry points out that the imperative to simply love fate provides absolutely no moral framework to condemn historical atrocities.
The author asks directly what the concept of loving fate can possibly mean when confronted with the horrors of Auschwitz.
Pure affirmation of reality offers no grounds for moral outrage when innocent people are suffering.
And this failure sets up the final section of the book. If the ancient cosmos was disproven by modern science, and if Christianity is ruled out by its reliance on faith.
And if modern humanism led to the totalitarian disasters of the 20th century, and postmodernism leads to moral paralysis, what is Ferry's actual proposal?
Right, where do we go? The book concludes by mapping out Ferry's own philosophy, which he terms post-Nietzschean humanism.
The text outlines this new humanism by first rejecting pure materialism. The book argues that a purely materialist worldview, where human beings are nothing more than biological accidents, cannot generate necessary moral outrage.
If we are just atoms colliding in a void, there is no objective reason to fight against injustice.
Ferry insists we must establish a foundation for meaning that does not rely on a supernatural God, but also does not reduce humanity to mere biology.
And to achieve this balance, the book introduces a concept called horizontal transcendence. Ferry argues that transcendence is actually embedded within our everyday secular lives.
We do not need a supernatural realm to experience things that are vastly greater than ourselves.
Right. When we encounter profound truth, authentic justice, or true beauty, we experience a transcendence that exists entirely within the bounds of human reality.
The book illustrates this using the philosopher Edmund Husserl's matchbox analogy, which I found incredibly helpful.
It is a great analogy.
When you hold a matchbox in your hand, your eyes only physically see 3 sides of it. However, your mind knows with absolute certainty that it has 6 sides.
The unseen sides represent a horizon of reality that exists beyond your immediate physical perception.
Similarly, our everyday experiences of beauty and justice point to a deeper structural transcendence. We do not invent these values, we discover them in the world.
Which leads to the ultimate grounding of Ferry's philosophy. The book presents love as the new secular basis for meaning.
Love is framed as a secular equivalent of religious grace.
It is the one force that reliably draws human beings out of their narrow self-interest and connects them to something larger than their own survival.
For the author, love provides the ethical orientation that previous eras sought in the stars or in divine commandments.
Finally, the book outlines the salvation offered by contemporary humanism. It is a wisdom that expands the self through this daily experience of love, through culture, and through human solidarity.
It demands that we face the terrifying reality of our own death and the deaths of those we love without the comfort of supernatural promises. We basically must find meaning entirely in the profound connections we forge in the present moment.
So to summarize, the book is a systematic mapping of how human beings have historically used reason to confront their own mortality. It traces a continuous, evolving debate across 5 distinct eras,
Demonstrating that the search for meaning in the face of death is really the defining characteristic of human thought.
If you want to understand how Ferry builds and defends these specific arguments, you can move on to the analysis review. If you want to hear these ideas evaluated and challenged, the critique and deep critique reviews are waiting for you.
Here are questions to carry into your own reading of this book. If philosophy demands we solve the fear of death using only our own reason, is a purely rational salvation actually possible for finite beings?
Furthermore, if Ferry is correct that modern human rights rely entirely on a Christian foundation, can those rights survive indefinitely in a purely secular framework?
Click the link on screen for related episodes, essential insights, summary, analysis, critique, or deep critique. Subscribe, share, purchase via the link if you'd like to read along, and think rationally. Explore the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments and nourish your mind on the go. Remember that human mortality is the shadow that hangs over us, but how we choose to reason our way through that darkness defines the very shape of our lives.